The ballroom at Beckford House held 300 guests on the night Margaret Langley refused an earl. She stood at the far edge of the room, near the doors to the terrace where the air was cooler and the candles did not press so close, wearing a gown of ivory muslin that Lady Beckford had selected from the previous season's cast-offs and had not troubled to have altered at the waist. The fabric pulled where it should not have pulled. It hung where it should have gathered. Margaret held her hands still at her sides and watched the dancers turn through a cotillion, and she did not allow herself to count the hours remaining before she could return to the narrow room on the third floor that smelled of linen and tallow and old wood. She was not a guest. She was a companion. The distinction lived in her shoes, which were her own and had been resoled twice. And in the single strand of paste beads Lady Beckford had permitted her to borrow for the occasion. Lord Ashworth crossed the ballroom floor in 4 measured strides. He stopped in front of her. He did not look at the dancers or the terrace doors. He looked at her, and his gaze held the particular quality of a man who had identified exactly what he intended to do and did not plan to be redirected from it. He extended his hand. "Miss Langley," he said, his voice low enough that only Margaret and the 2 women standing nearest could hear it. "Will you do me the honor?" It was not a question. The room had already noticed. 300 faces were in the process of turning, and Margaret could feel the collective attention settling on the outstretched glove, on the ivory muslin, on the paste beads, on the precise distance between an earl's hand and a companion's wrist. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She saw what she had been trained by 24 years of careful watching to see in a man of rank's gesture toward a woman who had nothing. She saw pity. "Thank you, my lord," she said. "I cannot accept." The silence that followed had weight. She could hear a glass being set down somewhere behind her, the click of crystal against wood, and then the whispered breath of Lady Beckford's fan resuming its rhythm 2 paces to her left. Lord Ashworth did not withdraw his hand immediately. He held it there for 3 full seconds, as though giving her the opportunity to reconsider, and when she did not move, he inclined his head once, returned his hand to his side, and walked back across the floor without looking at anyone. The whispers began before he reached the far wall. If you have ever watched someone stand perfectly still while a room decided what to make of her, you already know what happened next. Stay close. Lady Beckford's fan had not stopped moving, and it did not stop now. She leaned toward Miss Cressida Vaughan, who stood at her right in a gown of pale blue silk that had been fitted by the modiste on Half Moon Street and required no apology, and she said the thing she had been saying in various forms for 18 months. "The poor relation," Lady Beckford murmured, her voice carrying the particular polish of a woman who had learned to wound while maintaining the syntax of concern. "One cannot fault her pride, I suppose. One can only observe that pride in a woman without means is an inconvenience to everyone around her." Cressida's mouth curved. She did not respond. She did not need to. The label had been applied, and it would circulate through the ballroom by the end of the second set. Margaret stood where she was. She pressed her thumb against the spine of the small leather volume she kept in her reticule, the one her father had inscribed to her mother in the year of their marriage. The leather was soft from handling, the gilt letters nearly worn to nothing. She pressed until the edge of the binding dug into the pad of her thumb, and then she released the pressure and breathed. She had come to Lady Beckford's household 18 months ago, 3 weeks after her father's burial, with 1 trunk, the book of verse, and a letter from the solicitor confirming that the living had reverted to the diocese and the £200 per annum settled on her mother had passed to Margaret upon her mother's death 6 years prior. £200. Enough to live plainly in a set of rooms in Bath. Not enough. Lady Beckford had written in the letter that arrived before the earth on the grave had settled to maintain the dignity of the family name. Margaret had accepted the offer of a home because the alternative was to be seen accepting the alternative. And in the world Lady Beckford occupied, a young woman of good family who chose a set of rented rooms over the protection of her nearest relation was not admired for her independence. She was pitied, and then she was forgotten. The position Lady Beckford had described as companionship revealed its true architecture within the first week. Margaret read aloud in the mornings. She sorted correspondence in the afternoons. She accompanied Lady Beckford to calls and sat on the smaller chair and did not speak unless addressed. She ate at the family table when there were no guests and at the servants' table when there were, and she did not protest the distinction because Lady Beckford had explained it to her as a kindness. "You would not wish to be compared," Lady Beckford had said, adjusting the cameo at her throat. "Not with Cressida in the room." Cressida Vaughan was Lady Beckford's goddaughter and the season's most admired debutante. She was 20, fair, accomplished at the pianoforte, and possessed of £12,000, and the quiet confidence of a woman who had never been asked to sit at the wrong table. Lady Beckford had been cultivating the match between Cressida and Lord Ashworth since the autumn, and the ball at Beckford House had been designed with a single purpose, visible to everyone except, perhaps, Cressida herself. Margaret knew the purpose. She had addressed the invitations in her own hand. What she had not anticipated, standing at the edge of the ballroom in the ill-fitting ivory gown, was that Lord Ashworth would ignore Cressida entirely, cross the floor in front of 300 witnesses, and extend his hand to the woman who had written his name on a card and sealed it with someone else's wax. She had refused him because she knew what a wealthy man's attention to a dependent woman looked like from inside the dependent woman's life. She had watched it. Her mother, Eleanor Langley, had married Margaret's father out of obligation. The families had arranged it. Eleanor had been fond of him, and fondness had grown into something steady and warm over 20 years. And Margaret had loved them both. She had also watched her mother move through those 20 years with a particular careful grace, the grace of a woman who understood that her comfort, her home, her children's bread, her place at the table, all of it rested on the good will of a man she had not chosen but had been given to. Eleanor had never complained. She had carried the weight of gratitude the way other women carried prayer books, close to her body and never far from reach. Margaret had decided at 14, watching her mother pour tea with hands that shook slightly when the rector visited and her father was called away, that she would not marry a man whose offer carried the shape of rescue. She would not live inside the arithmetic of obligation. She would not press her thumb against the spine of a borrowed life and call it her own. She did not know, standing in the ballroom with the whispers settling around her like fine dust, that Lord Ashworth had not crossed the floor out of pity. She did not know that he had been watching her for 6 weeks, since the afternoon he had called on Lady Beckford and found Margaret in the morning room reading aloud from a volume of Cowper to no one, the chair opposite hers empty, her voice steady and clear and directed at the fire, as though the fire were the only audience she required. She did not know that he had returned 3 times since, each visit explained by some plausible errand, each errand ending with him standing in whatever room she occupied, listening to whatever she happened to be saying, watching the way her hands moved when she did not know she was observed. She knew only that an earl had offered his hand, and she had refused it, and that the room would make of that refusal exactly what the room wished. Lord Ashworth arrived at Beckford House the following morning at 10:30. He arrived without invitation, without announcement, and without the company of any mutual acquaintance who might have softened the oddness of the visit. He handed his card to the footman and was shown to the morning room, where Lady Beckford sat with Cressida and Margaret, the tea things already laid, and the fire built low because Lady Beckford believed that a warm room encouraged idleness. Margaret saw him in the doorway and felt the heat rise to her throat. Lady Beckford rose. Her composure was immediate and complete, the composure of a woman who had managed drawing rooms for 30 years and did not intend to be outmaneuvered in her own home. "Lord Ashworth, what a pleasure. We did not expect you." "No," he said. He entered the room and did not sit. He stood near the window, where the morning light caught the sharp line of his jaw and the shadow beneath his cheekbone. And he looked at Margaret with the same unhurried directness he had shown the night before. "I came to ask Miss Langley if she would walk with me in the garden." Margaret's fingers tightened on the saucer in her lap. "My lord, I do not think that would be appropriate." "Sit down then," he said. "Drink your tea. I will wait." He sat. He accepted the cup Cressida offered him with a nod that was correct in every particular and personal in none. Lady Beckford watched with the rigid attention of a woman recalculating a sum that had come out wrong. Cressida poured beautifully, her wrist turning at the precise angle the modiste's deportment master had prescribed, and Lord Ashworth thanked her without looking at her hands. He looked at Margaret's hands, her hands, which held the plain cup without affectation. The knuckles slightly reddened from the cold water she used to wash her own linen, because the household laundress had been instructed not to trouble herself with Miss Langley's things. "Miss Langley," he said, after a silence that lasted long enough for Lady Beckford's composure to develop a faint crack along one temple. "I understand that you keep a volume of verse. Cowper, I believe." Margaret stared at him. "I do." "Will you read something from it?" It was, again, not a question. It was a command shaped like a request, and it carried the same quality she had heard the night before, the quality of a man who had decided and did not intend to be deterred by the inconvenience of her refusal. Lady Beckford's fan had appeared from somewhere and was moving in short, irritated strokes. Margaret opened her reticule. She drew out the leather volume. She opened it to a page near the middle, where the spine was most softened, and she read 4 lines of Cowper in the clear, steady voice she had developed over 18 months of reading aloud to rooms that did not listen. Lord Ashworth listened. He sat with his cup untouched and his shoulders set against the chair back, and his face arranged in the expression Margaret had come to associate with men of rank, the expression that gave nothing and expected everything. And he listened to her read with the concentration of a man hearing evidence he intended to act upon. When she finished, he set his cup down. "Thank you," he said. He rose, bowed to Lady Beckford and to Cressida, and left. Margaret sat holding the open book. She did not know what had happened, she knew only that her hands were trembling, and that the room felt warmer than the low fire should have permitted, and that the volume of verse lay open in her lap to a page her father had marked with a pressed leaf of hawthorn that had gone brown and translucent with age. "Close the book, Margaret," Lady Beckford said. Her voice carried the temperature of January. "You have made yourself conspicuous quite enough." The next 10 days carried a pattern Margaret could not have predicted and could not seem to prevent. Lord Ashworth called on Lady Beckford every second day. He arrived at 10:30. He accepted tea from Cressida. He spoke correctly to Lady Beckford about matters of no consequence, the renovation of the assembly rooms, the probability of rain before Thursday, the health of Lord Ashworth's mother in Hampshire. And then, at some point during the visit, he turned his attention to Margaret with the unhurried precision of a man consulting a text he intended to memorize. He asked her about Cowper. He asked her about her father's parish. He asked her once whether the fire was warm enough. and when she said it was, he called for the footman and had it built higher without looking at Lady Beckford for permission. On the second visit, he noticed that Margaret's teacup had been filled only once, while Cressida's had been refilled twice. He lifted the pot himself and poured for Margaret before Lady Beckford could intervene. The tea was the good china black, the kind Lady Beckford reserved for guests of rank. Margaret's hand trembled as she accepted the cup, and Lord Ashworth watched the tremor in her fingers with the still concentrated attention of a man taking note of evidence. On the third visit, he arrived with a book. He placed it on the table beside Margaret's chair without explanation. It was a collected edition of Cowper, newer than her father's volume, with clean pages and an unbroken spine. "Your copy is wearing through," he said, his voice level. "This one will last." He did not frame it as a gift. He framed it as maintenance, the way a man might observe that a fence post needed replacing. Margaret stared at the book and did not touch it for the duration of the visit, and when he left, she placed her hand flat on the cover and held it there until the leather warmed. "Come inside," he said on the fourth visit, when he found her standing in the garden passage with a letter in her hand and her shawl pulled tight against the March wind. He did not ask what the letter contained. He did not offer comfort. He placed his hand briefly at her elbow and guided her toward the morning room, and when she sat, he stood at the window and said nothing until the color returned to her face. The letter had been from Mr. Thornhill, Lady Beckford's second cousin, a man of 40 with an estate in Shropshire that generated 1,100 a year, and a manner that suggested he regarded women as a category of domestic furniture that occasionally required reupholstering. He had written to inform Margaret that Lady Beckford had raised the subject of an arrangement. He wished Margaret to understand that he was not opposed. Margaret had read the letter twice. She had pressed her thumb against the spine of her father's book until the edge cut into her skin. She had not cried. She had walked to the garden passage because it was the only part of the house where she could stand alone without being observed. And she had stood there calculating the distance between £200 per annum in a set of rooms in Bath and the rest of her life at Mr. Thornhill's table in Shropshire. And she had not been able to make either figure resolve into something she recognized as living. Lord Ashworth had found her there. He had not asked. He had simply said, "Come inside." It was at Lady Tremain's garden party, on the 6th day, that Margaret saw Lord Ashworth see her clearly for the first time. Lady Beckford had brought Margaret to carry the parasol and the wrap and the small case of visiting cards, and Margaret had stood at the edge of the lawn holding all three, while Lady Beckford and Cressida circulated among the guests. A housemaid, newly hired and unfamiliar with Lady Beckford's household, had approached Margaret to offer lemonade, and Lady Beckford's housekeeper, Mrs. Wells, had intervened sharply. "Not for her. She is staff." The girl had flushed and withdrawn. Margaret had said nothing. She had continued standing with the parasol and the wrap and the case, and she had watched the girl retreat to the service entrance, and then she had done the thing she should not have done. She set down the parasol. She walked across the lawn to the service entrance. She found the girl sitting on the step, with her hands pressed flat against her apron, and her face blotched with the particular misery of a person who has been corrected in front of others for a mistake she could not have anticipated. "It was not your fault," Margaret said, crouching beside her. "The lemonade looked very fine. I should have liked a glass." Lord Ashworth stood 30 paces away, near the rose arbor, with a glass in his hand he had not raised to his mouth. He watched Margaret crouch beside the housemaid. He watched her take the girl's hand briefly. He watched her rise and smooth her skirt, and return to her position at the edge of the lawn with the parasol and the wrap. And he did not move for a long time. A matron whose name Margaret did not catch leaned toward her companion on the nearest bench and said, in the carrying voice of a woman accustomed to being overheard, "The poor relation. Befriending the staff now. Well?" One supposes she has found her natural level. Margaret's spine straightened. Her hands did not shake. She held the parasol and the wrap and the case, and she looked at the rose arbor. And Lord Ashworth was looking back at her. His face had changed. The expression she had catalogued as Rank's habitual indifference had cracked along a line she had not previously seen, and what lived beneath it was not pity, and was not amusement, and was not the practiced interest of a man performing a season's obligations. It was recognition. It was the face of a man who had just confirmed something he had suspected for weeks. He turned away. He set down his glass. He left the garden party without speaking to Lady Beckford, or to Cressida, or to anyone else. 5 days later, on the evening of a small supper Lady Beckford hosted for select acquaintances, Lord Ashworth sat beside Margaret at the table and told her about Charlotte. The seating had not been Lady Beckford's design. She had placed Lord Ashworth between Cressida and a baronet's wife of impeccable connections, and she had placed Margaret at the far end of the table near Mr. Thornhill, who had arrived that afternoon from Shropshire with a trunk and a letter of introduction. Lord Ashworth had looked at the arrangement, had looked at the card with his name beside Cressida's place, and had moved it. He picked up the card between 2 fingers and carried it to the empty chair beside Margaret and set it down without ceremony. Lady Beckford's face did not change. Her hand, adjusting the flowers at the center of the table, went still for 3 full seconds before resuming. Margaret sat with her hands in her lap, and her heart beating so loudly she was certain he could hear it. She could feel the warmth of him beside her, the particular quality of presence a large man carries, the displacement of air, the faint scent of wool and soap and something resinous she could not name. She did not look at him. She looked at her plate. He did not explain why he was telling her. He spoke in the low, level voice Margaret had come to recognize as his only register of honest speech, and he said that his wife had died 4 years ago of a fever contracted on a journey she had undertaken alone. He said that after her death, he had found letters she had written to a friend, letters that described with calm precision the particular unhappiness of a woman who had married a title and discovered that the man inside it was not the man she had wanted. He said he had read every letter. He said he had not destroyed them. She was not wrong, he said. His thumb traced the base of his wine glass, a slow circuit that did not complete. I did not see her. I saw the match. I saw the arrangement. I saw what the world confirmed. I did not see what it cost her. His hand rested on the table near his glass, and Margaret noticed for the first time that he wore no ring. The 4th finger of his left hand bore a faint pale line where a ring had been, and the skin had not quite returned to the color of the rest. I am sorry, Margaret said. Do not be sorry, he said. Be accurate. That is what I require. She understood then, not fully, not yet, what he was telling her. She understood that he had crossed the ballroom not out of pity, and not out of obligation, and not out of the particular careless generosity of a man whose rank permitted him any whim. He had crossed the floor because he had learned, through the particular education of loss, to look at what was actually in front of him. He had seen her, and what he had seen was not a companion in an ill-fitting gown. It was a woman reading Cowper to an empty chair with steady hands. She did not see it yet. You might. The morning is coming. Margaret pressed her thumb against the spine of the volume in her reticule. The hawthorn leaf crackled faintly beneath the leather. 3 days later, Lady Beckford summoned Margaret to the drawing-room and announced, in the presence of Cressida and Mr. Thornhill and the solicitor, Mr. Graves, that Margaret's situation had been resolved. Mr. Thornhill had agreed to the arrangement. The wedding would take place in June. Margaret's £200 per annum would pass to Mr. Thornhill's management upon the marriage, and Lady Beckford's household would be relieved of the expense and inconvenience of maintaining a companion who had proven herself, in Lady Beckford's measured phrase, more trouble than her situation warrants. Mr. Thornhill stood by the mantel with his hands clasped behind his back and his face arranged in the satisfied expression of a man who has acquired a useful item at a reasonable price. He did not look at Margaret as a man looks at a woman he wishes to marry. He looked at her as a man looks at a column of figures that has come out in his favor. Margaret stood in the center of the drawing room. She could feel the walls pressing closer. She could feel the familiar architecture of obligation assembling itself around her. The same architecture her mother had lived inside for 20 years. The same arithmetic of gratitude and diminishment and careful grace. She could feel it closing, and she could feel the small leather volume in her reticule pressing against her hip. And she could feel her mother's hands shaking over the tea things. And she could feel the weight of every morning she had spent reading aloud to a room that did not listen. "No," Margaret said. Lady Beckford's fan stopped. "No," Margaret said again. Her voice was steady. Her hands were steady. "I will not marry Mr. Thornhill. I will not have my income managed by a man I did not choose. I will take my £200 and my father's book, and I will go to Bath. And I will live plainly. And I will read to myself in my own room. And I will not apologize for the cost of my pride." The silence that followed was not like the silence at the ballroom. It was smaller and more dangerous. Lady Beckford's face had gone white at the cheekbones, and Cressida's hand had risen to the pearl at her throat, and Mr. Thornhill's expression had shifted from satisfaction to the particular bewilderment of a man whose column of figures has just been challenged by the item itself. In the kitchen passage below the drawing room, two of Lady Beckford's housemaids stood with a tray of cold meats between them and listened to the silence that followed. "The poor relation," one said to the other, standing there telling Lady Beckford she would rather have nothing. "My word, she will be out of this house by morning." Margaret was given until Friday. She spent the remaining days packing her trunk. The process took very little time because she had arrived with very little and had acquired nothing since. The gown of ivory muslin went back to the wardrobe it had come from. The paste beads went back to the case. The collected Cowper Lord Ashworth had brought on his third visit she placed beside the wardrobe door, unsure whether returning a gift was more conspicuous than keeping one, and in the end she left it on the chair by the window where anyone might find it, or no one might notice. The small leather volume went into the trunk, wedged between a chemise and a pair of woolen stockings her mother had knitted the winter before she died. Margaret folded each garment with the precise economy of a woman who had learned to fit her life into a small space, and did not resent the skill, only the occasion for it. Mrs. Pritchard came to her room on the second evening and sat on the edge of the narrow bed without speaking. She had brought a cup of broth from the kitchen and a heel of bread wrapped in a cloth, and she set them on the washstand and looked at Margaret with the particular steady grief of a woman who has watched 2 generations of the same family diminished by the same machinery. "Your father would not have wanted this," Mrs. Pritchard said. "My father is not here," Margaret said. She did not say it sharply. She said it the way one states a figure in an account ledger, a number that cannot be argued because it has already been entered. Lord Ashworth had not called. He had not written. In the 6 days since the supper where he had told her about Charlotte, she had heard nothing from him, and she had begun to understand, with the slow, terrible clarity of a woman who has been accurate about the world since she was 14, that she had been wrong. Not wrong about the pity, wrong about the recognition, wrong about the way his face had changed at the garden party, the way his voice had carried when he told her about the letters, the way his hand had rested near hers on the table with the pale line of the absent ring. She had read all of it as seeing, and she had been wrong. and the wrongness sat in her chest like a stone she could not cough up or swallow. She drank the broth. She finished packing the trunk. She wrote to a woman in Bath who kept rooms for single gentlewomen. She pressed the hawthorn leaf flat between the pages of the Cowper and closed the book gently. On Friday evening, Lady Beckford held the second ball of the season at Beckford House. 300 guests. The same ballroom, the same candles pressing close. Margaret had not been invited, and she had not expected to be. She sat in her narrow room on the third floor and listened to the music rise through the floorboards. At 9 o'clock, Mrs. Pritchard appeared at her door. Mrs. Pritchard, who had been her father's housekeeper in the parish, and who now worked in Lady Beckford's kitchen, because the world had narrowed for both of them in the same season. Mrs. Pritchard held a clean white gown over her arm. Not fashionable, not new, pressed with the iron that morning. "Put this on," Mrs. Pritchard said. "You are wanted downstairs." Margaret stared at her. By whom? By the man who has been driving Lady Beckford to distraction for a fortnight. By the man who told Mr. Graves this afternoon that the arrangement with Mr. Thornhill would not proceed. By the man standing in the ballroom at this moment in front of every person who watched you refuse him 2 weeks ago. Mrs. Pritchard held out the gown. Her eyes were bright. "Put it on, child." Margaret descended the staircase. She wore the white gown. She wore her own shoes, resoled twice. She wore no jewels. She carried the small leather volume in her hand, because her reticule did not match the dress, and she would not leave the book behind. The ballroom was full. The candles were the same. The faces turning toward her were the same faces that had watched her refuse an earl's hand 14 days earlier, and they wore the same expressions of calibrated interest and polite anticipation that the season demanded. Lady Beckford stood near the musicians with Cressida at her side, and her fan was moving, and her face was the face of a woman who understood that the sum she had been managing for 18 months had just been taken out of her hands. Mr. Thornhill was not present. Mr. Graves stood near the terrace doors, with a document folded beneath his arm. Lord Ashworth stood in the center of the floor. He stood where he had stood 14 days ago, and he was looking at the staircase, and when Margaret appeared at the top of it, he did not move. He waited. He let her descend. He let her cross the last 12 feet of polished wood between the bottom of the staircase and the place where he stood. And he did not extend his hand. He let her come to him. She stopped in front of him. The room held its breath. "Miss Langley," he said, and his voice carried to every corner. He did not look at Lady Beckford. He did not look at Cressida. He did not look at the 300 guests who had decided, 14 days ago, what to make of the poor relation in the ill-fitting gown. He looked at Margaret, and his face was the face she had seen at the garden party. The mask cracked open along the line that ran from his jaw to his eyes, and what lived beneath it was not practiced, and was not performed, and was not the habitual expression of a man whose rank permitted any gesture. "Miss Langley is to be my wife." The words fell into the silence like a stone into still water, and the ripples moved outward through the room. Lady Beckford's fan stopped. Cressida's hand dropped from the pearl at her throat. Near the terrace doors, Mr. Graves unfolded the document and held it where the nearest witnesses could see the seal. Lady Beckford opened her mouth. She closed it. She opened it again. "She is," she began, and her voice, which had been polished and controlled and precisely calibrated for 30 years, cracked on the second word like a cup set down too hard. "She is the poor relation. She has nothing. She has £200 and a book of verse, and the pride to refuse what is offered to her." "Yes," Lord Ashworth said. He did not raise his voice. He did not turn. He spoke with the level certainty of a man confirming a fact he had verified. She does. The room understood. The room understood all at once. The way a room understands when a verdict it has been carrying for weeks is suddenly and publicly reversed by someone whose authority exceeds the authority of the woman who issued it. Margaret Langley had refused his hand. She had refused it because she would not be rescued. She had refused it because her mother's life had taught her what rescue cost. And the Earl of Ashworth had not withdrawn. He had not moved on to the woman in pale blue silk who had been fitted and prepared and positioned for his selection. He had returned, and he had returned. And he had settled the legal obstacle without telling her. And he had waited until the same room was full of the same witnesses. And he had let her walk to him in her own shoes. Lady Beckford sat down. No one helped her to her chair. Cressida, standing beside her, looked at Margaret for a long moment, with an expression that was not jealousy, and was not contempt, and was, perhaps, the first honest expression Margaret had seen on her face in 18 months. It was the expression of a woman realizing that the script she had been given did not account for this. 3 guests near the musicians began to applaud, and then 5 more, and then the room. Margaret did not look at the room. She looked at Lord Ashworth. She looked at the face that had learned, through loss, to see what was actually in front of it. She looked at the pale line on his 4th finger, where the ring had been, and was not. And she understood finally that the hand he had extended to her 14 days ago had not carried the shape of rescue. It had carried the shape of a man asking to be seen in return. "Edmund," she said. His name. His given name. The first time she had spoken it aloud. It fell into the silence the applause had left, and his face changed again. And for the first time since she had known him, the line that ran from his jaw to his eyes was not a crack. It was simply his face. Open. He took her hand. She let him. The fire in the morning room at Ashworth Park burned low and orange on the evening Margaret moved the leather volume from her trunk to the shelf beside the window. She placed it between a collected cowper and a guide to the county's wildflowers that someone, years ago, had marked with small pencil notes in the margins. The hawthorn leaf still pressed flat between the pages. She did not open it. She did not need to. Edmund sat in the chair by the fire with a letter he was not reading. The letter was from Lady Beckford, brief and correct, acknowledging the engagement in the language of a woman who had recognized, finally, that the sum had been taken out of her hands and would not be returned. Cressida had written separately, 2 lines, wishing Margaret well. The handwriting was very even. Mrs. Pritchard had come with Margaret to Ashworth Park. She had been given the housekeeper's rooms and a wage that did not require her to choose between lamp oil and tea. She moved through the house with the quiet authority of a woman returning to the kind of work she understood, and she did not call Margaret Miss Langley anymore. She called her my lady, with the particular emphasis of a person who has been waiting to say the words for 2 years. The morning room faced east. In the mornings, the light came through the window and fell across the shelf where the volume of verse stood, and the gilt letters caught the sun, and the worn leather glowed the color of dark honey. Margaret had read from it that morning. She had read 4 lines of Cowper, the same 4 lines she had read to an empty chair in Lady Beckford's morning room 6 weeks earlier, and this time the chair opposite hers had not been empty. Edmund had listened. He had sat with his cup in his hands and his shoulders set against the chair back, and he had listened with the same unhurried attention he had given her from the beginning. The attention that was not pity, and was not obligation, and was not the performance of rank. It was simply the attention of a man who had learned, at great cost, to look at what was in front of him. The fire settled. A log shifted, sending a fine spray of sparks against the grate. Outside the window, the first green of April was showing in the hedgerows along the drive, and a thrush was singing from the elm at the corner of the kitchen garden, the same elm Mrs. Pritchard had already claimed as the best vantage for watching the lane. Margaret sat in the chair by the window. She did not hold the book. She did not need to hold it. The book was on the shelf beside the cowper, in the house that was hers now, in the room where the fire burned low and the light came through the glass, and the chair opposite hers would not be empty again. She pressed her thumb against the arm of the chair, the same small gesture she had carried for years, and the wood was warm and solid, and did not give. Thank you for staying until the end. If Margaret's story moved you, leave a quiet word where others might find it. The thrush sang. The fire held. The morning came in.